Thank you very much for being here to this event. I thank very much Lumen Christi Institute and first of all Thomas Levergood for giving me the opportunity to make a short presentation of this book. In fact, I wondered whether it was useful to make a presentation of this book, whether it deserved such a ceremony, because it is in my career, so to speak, a strange book, which, because I've not written that book, in fact it was written without me. The story goes that when I was just elected to the French Académie, one of my publishers told me to publish something which could be accessible, if not eatable, if not palatable to a wider public. Publishers are always obsessed by that. And so I decided to perhaps to collect quickly some public lectures or public papers which I have devoted to issues of public interest. And I discovered that the 12 texts I've selected, which were published in the last 30 years, so it's quite a consistent period, were mostly devoted to the same and only question, which in fact has pervaded all my more scholarly books, which is a question of relation between faith and reason, the so-called question. And the motto was given to me by the experience I made in 2005. The book was published in 2010, it was prepared in 2008, but what triggered the whole thing was a very difficult experience, I have to say. Cardinal Lustiger asked me to be the first layman to give a public lecture in the Cathedral of Paris, Notre Dame, for Lent, because there is a tradition started with Lacordaire in the 19th century, that there are, during Lent, each Sunday, a very public lecture by Catholic intellectual. But until that moment, it was only priests and monks and people of the clergy. So I was asked by Cardinal Lustiger, it is one of the last things I've done for him and with him, to give a lecture being as the professor. And it's a bit disturbing because Notre Dame is Notre Dame. The crowd, and you have so many people who have given a lecture, and you are not qualified. You are only a layman. So it was for me a bit demanding, and I started to speak about reason and faith, to argue that the fact to believe does not give you any opportunity to give up, to argue, to think, to be reasoning, but it is an additional reason to be reasonable and reasoning. And that the choice is never between faith and reason. I have seen and experienced even close friends who have losing faith, but it was not to conquer more reason. Most of the time, when people give up faith, they give up a part of a possible rationality, and not the contrary. And so this was my central point. And I hope at least to be not a bad example of the connection between those two kind of thought, faith and reason. So before coming to the heart of the thing, or rather I shall insist on the art of the issue by just explaining the title given to this lecture, The Only Way to Truth is by Love. This, as you know well, is a quotation from St. Augustine in the Contra Faustum, chapter 22. Non intratur in veritatem, nisi per caritatem. There is no other way to get in truth than through charity, love. And I've commented this at length in my book on Augustine, but in fact, no less than Heidegger in Being and Time has quoted this sentence by Augustine. It is in Being and Time, section 29, footnote. And Heidegger has taken this sentence with no theological and Christian intention at all. It was exactly the reverse, because it was useful for his own phenomenological analysis. And the point was that when we think, we don't think the way Descartes told us that we should think. You know that at the very beginning of the Meditations by Descartes, he makes a very clear warning, announcement. I shall doubt everything, but be serious, I shall not doubt the sentences, the truth, theory, propositions, only from a theoretical point of view. That is, I shall not behave as if I was in my daily life uncertain. I am really certain that I do live, that I speak, that I am who I am. It's not about ethical, social issues that I doubt. I doubt only from the point of view of theory. And Heidegger, and he did. And this restriction has puzzled Heidegger, and he was right. It has puzzled Pascal as well. That is, in fact, the real use of thought is that we are not spontaneously, and most of the time we are not spontaneously, neither spontaneously nor most of the time, in the theoretical attitude. When we try to be neutral enough to be in the disinterested theoretical attitude, it is when we go to a classroom to sit in a class at the University of Chicago. At that moment, we learn physics, we learn mathematics, biblical Hebrew, and all that kind of stuff, and we have to be very focused on that, and we dismiss all our daily preoccupation. We are right. But it does not last the whole day. Only a few hours a day, and only some days in the year, and not all the years of a lifetime, the rest of the life. And after leaving the University of Chicago, another university, we shall be back to the real world. The real world is a world where we are not neutral. And every truth we learn, every information we get, every sense data we experience is always taken in a broader view and situation, which is a situation where an information may be a good news or a bad news. If you go to hospital to check the result of your analysis, it is a scientific information. You have too much sugar or anything. But it is also, and perhaps first, a good news or bad news. And in your when you discuss with your banker, he gives you information, numbers. It is a good news or a bad news. So we are not neutral when we think, most of the time. It's only by attraction, by decision, and for a limited time that we can reach a disinterested point of view. But it is not the regular point of view, and it has not to be the regular point of view. Because in daily, real life, we have to take action to decide, to make choices, and those choices indeed involve to be related to the non-neutral reality, which is the real world. So, Heidegger, explaining this, and it is completely right, says that any analysis of the human condition, of what he calls the Dasein, should start from the non-theoretical point of view, from the global point of view, which is not neutral, where the theoretical point of view is always connected and mixed with the practical point of view. And that our freedom, our destiny, is about the practical point of view. And to explain that, he says, he quotes Thomas Aquinas, the only way to go to truth is through and by charity. Heidegger did not mean that he was suggesting that all his readers practice charity. It was far of his intention. No, what he meant was this, that be serious when the debate goes to the issue of truth. You cannot afford to pretend to remain neutral. You may love the truth or hate truth, depending on the situation. It is exactly the doctrine of Augustine. Which means that my relation to truth is not neutral. It is largely and correctly in relation to my interest, my inclinations, my habits, my customs, my need, my hidden or conscious desires, and so on. And if you want to have an access to truth, it is precisely because you carry, so to speak, on the shoulder of your mind all those concerns. And this is why we should ask ourselves the question of what we mean by reason. Reason is perhaps much more than the classical understanding of reason, in particular when there is this strong opposition between faith and reason, is meant. So I divided my collection of paper in 4 parts, according to 4 questions. First, what is the today situation of faith and reason? To sum it up and to be quick, my point was, and I explained that under the vault of Notre Dame, it was a bit strange. I explained how far Nietzsche was right. Nietzsche was right because he was the first to explain that in the alleged conflict between faith and reason, the weakest of the 2 competitors is indeed reason and not faith. Faith is very much alive. It may be used to support irrational position, but it is very much alive. And the last century was full of ideologies, has made a great use of faith. A wicked and bad use of faith, an evil use of faith perhaps, but a real use of faith. All totalitarian regimes are based on faith. Misuse faith, but faith. Now, what is the characteristic of the recent moments, modern or postmodern, is the weakness of reason. Why? Nietzsche has explained that, and he was not the first, but he was a more convincing one. We have downsized reason to the level of what Descartes first called mathesis universalis, the universal knowledge. And what is the universal knowledge? It is a knowledge which pay attention only to this part of rationality which always succeed. The part of rationality which always succeeds is the part who pay attention only to what can be measured and put into order, what we call right now the parameters and the models. And the technical word, which has that property to always succeed, whatever it could is the cost, whatever it is succeeding to build up objects. If you pay attention from about the real world only to what can be measured and what can be put into order in a consistent model, you win. And you build up, and after that you produce objects. This is a very efficient model of rationality. It was invented in the beginning of the 17th century, and it is in full array, in full triumph right now. But there is a price to pay for that. That is, rationality is meant now to mean only that. That is, the intelligibility, the poorest possible intelligibility, that of material technical objects. And we try to make everything into such a material object, including our own living body, our own mind and psyche, and so on. And possibly, why not, God and religions, to explain them as objects, because we can do that. But the problem is when the difficulty starts, when we discover that the more we succeed, the more we are disappointed. Because we understand what in the real world and the real issue can be understood when instead of the thing itself, you substitute for it an object. And so you have very complex psychological problems, you have moods, you have dreams, you have pains, and so on. And instead of that, you have some psychiatric and therapeutic advices, and you take pills, and you are supposed to be better. And you are better. But you are better, but all the problems stay there, just beneath. This weakness of reason does not mean that reason is not technologically working. It means that the more it is working and succeeding, the less it addresses the real issues. But substitute another word to that, which is the word of technology. And Nietzsche has explained that. He has explained that we have downsized truth to the level of what he calls evaluation. Evaluation. As James used to say about religious experience, he used to say we have to reduce all the ideals to their real truth, which is their cash value. To reduce the thing to their cash values, which is a rational way to do, is exactly evaluation. And evaluation means that things have no value, because this value is given, imposed to the thing. So the stocks on the stock market have no standing value in themselves. Each time the clock sounds in Wall Street, all the values start again to be evaluated. So they have something which is evaluated has no value. It is not a paradox, it is a definition of evaluation. And everything in our world is now a value, including its moral world, not only the economical world. This is nihilism. Nihilism is when reason is too weak to have kept this huge ambition to understand the thing as they are. Instead, we understand the thing insofar as they became objects. And this is the crisis of reason. And so there is something very strange in the old-fashioned Enlightenment stand against faith. the opponent to faith claim to be rationalist, and that outside of them there is no rational speech. But in fact, they are deeply rationalist, because they admit that reason is so weak that at the end, reason can give us only evaluations. That is, a subjective interpretation of the things which does not reach the deep level of reality. And so this weakness of reason is the most obvious and perhaps nevertheless not well known background of our situation. And footnote in politics, for instance, we are not in a situation of crisis. I speak for the US as well as for Europe. We are not in a situation of crisis. In a situation of crisis, it is possible to take action and improve the situation by deciding something. And the situation where we are, it's why political leaders appear as powerless and, in fact, not leading anything. Not only every possible solution program will prove inefficient, and we don't know exactly what is the right option, but we know that there is no right option. That is the difference between crisis and decadence. We are in a situation of decadence, not in a situation of crisis. So decadence is where no crisis even is anymore possible. Everyone sees the problems, everyone is aware, everyone denies the issues or is unable to face them. This is the situation, a result of the weak understanding of reason. So let us start with that. After that, there is a second question. If we take, it was my case, the position of a believer, the rank and file churchgoer, close or a bit away, but agreeing, in fact, to the teaching of Christian faith, in a way or another, or at least considering the possibility of. Who is able to stand and to face the situation correctly from a Christian point of view? Let us go to faith now. So I've discovered that there are two requirements. The first is that a Christian should never imagine that to be a good Christian, he should be a convinced and very committed Christian. I mean, to be a believer is not to be an activist. A good believer is not the best possible activist. The political, social commitment is very important, but it should not take the style of being only, first of all, an activist. Why? For it is not a question of political orientation or political background. It is the experience of the two last centuries. Each time the Christians, and in France the Catholics were very much in that situation, decide to be serious believers. They started to be activists in the Catholic action, for instance, Catholic unions, Catholic political parties. And the result is that they were perhaps very good Christians, this is not my point, but you behave concretely the same way than your competitors, because there is only one way to be an activist. You are using the the same tools, either by posting, shouting, demonstrating, using computers and social media, anything. We are doing the same thing. And as it is well known, the medium is the message. The medium is the message. And if you imagine that your faith and your Christian commitment implies that you are a good activist supporting your cause, you will be a good activist supporting your cause. But the way you will support your cause will contradict your cause. That is, in fact, the Christian style is completely different, and the way to be active is completely different. It is both more personal, more secret, and much more powerful and public. It's why there are the creation of religious order and many other things which are not activist organizations. So it was my first point about who are we to speak about faith. And the second thing is that a real Christian not only cannot oppose faith, reason, but is one of the rather few people who stand for reason with the ambition to have a powerful and broad reason. Broad reason, a wider reason, that was one of the claims of Nietzsche. Nietzsche says in the Those Spoke Zarathustra, it is 1:4, it is about the people who contempt the living body. And he says, you are very proud of your reason, the reason who says, I am a mind, I think, and so on, the theoretical mind. But you should be much more proud, much prouder of your broader reason. It is the reason of your living body, according to the rule of Nietzsche. It is the body who thinks. By body, it means the complete, entire I. That is, the body thinks insofar as I think with my understanding, but also with my sensations, with my will, my imagination, and everything coming with that. That is my desire, my nostalgia, my hidden ambitions, and my hidden pains, and so on. So there is much more than my conscious I who is thinking when I think. And Nietzsche says, this is the broader reason. And the Christians are in charge of the broader reason. The broader reason is a reason which is wider than our own individual consciousness. It's why we are rooted in tradition. Tradition doesn't mean that we are conservative. Conservative are people who imagine that they rule their tradition. But to be a real traditionalist is to know that you are a part of a story we started without you, before you, and which is much stronger than you are. So you are, in fact, much stronger than you could even imagine. You are supported by your tradition. That means the story of the people who live the same experience than you, perhaps in another way, and which are now making you the heir of that long experience. So you are supported by a tradition, which is an history, which is a successful history, because you are there. Would this tradition have failed, you would not be there. So you are supported by not your past, but by the previous experience of others on the same track. So tradition gives you a future, not only a present, but a future. So we are in that situation, and we can claim to be the heir of a broader reason. And it's why it is crucial for Christians to do what the first father of the church in the first century, before that Christianity was allowed as a public religion in the Roman Empire, during the most difficult period when they were prosecuted and led to martyrdom for many of them. During this period, what were the options? One of the options was to have been an activist, to have used the means of resistance, Widerstand, like the Zealots among the Jews and Masada and things like that. They decided not to fight back, politically speaking, and instead to argue. They claimed to be philosophers, the Christians. Justin, for instance, his official title now, Saint Justin, is philosopher and martyr, which is nothing. Philosopher and martyr. You could not imagine that a philosopher could be at the same moment a martyr. He was both. And to my opinion, a good one. I don't say martyr, I cannot judge, but good philosopher. And so he was addressing the next, he was a vice emperor to that moment, Marcus Aurelius, who both to be a philosopher. So his title was emperor and philosopher. So he sent him a public speech telling him, you are a philosopher? That's good, I am too. So let us argue. What do you have against the Christians? In fact, I can tell you, you have nothing. So the emperor was defeated by arguments. And I think that the Christians should raise the issue, be very combative, and speak loud and clear, but with arguments. And there is a good reason for that. Because arguments are not only the best possible tactic, but arguments are required. It is compulsory for Christians to use arguments. Why? Because as Peter used to say in a very famous formulation, first letter by Peter 3:15, we have to be ready to give an apology, an argument, to anyone who asks us to give good reason of the hope which is in us. The hope which is in us has good reasons, and we are supposed to give those good reasons. There is a logos argument to support our hope, and there is the duty to give an apologia, that is, to render the logos to anyone asking for our reason to behave as we do. And this duty, obligation to make the apologia, which is to give our logos reason, is based on the fact that one of the names of God is precisely logos. You can translate logos by reason, you can translate logos by principle, you can translate logos by speech, you can translate logos by argument. To give a logos, which is the philosophical word by excellence, logos. It is the Greek word, logos. So indeed, the revelation of Christ is not the revelation within Greek philosophy of that time, but it is a fact that the Christians have used, and not only the Christians, the Jews in Alexandria, when they translated Davar into Greek, they said logos, wisely enough. So logos is not optional for us. We have to be logical. And very strangely enough, there is a text in the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 10, 17, I think. Very famous formulation, logike latreia, which was translated by, most of the time in 17th century, in the time of Enlightenment, by the sacrifice of the understanding. Sacrifice of the understanding. Latreia was translated by sacrifice, and logike, logical sacrifice, sacrifice of the understanding, which is not only inaccurate as a translation, but it is very wicked and tricky. Because the meaning is, if you want to have a cult, a ritual toward God, as a Christian, this ritual should be logique, that is, rational. No irrational behavior toward God, including in liturgy. It's why, to some extent, you can argue that liturgy is the most rational theatrical performance ever. Not only the most successful. When you go to Mass, you have to keep in mind this. There is no other playwright which was as successful as the Ordo of the Mass, which is played again, everywhere, at any time. So it is the first playwright ever. And what is fascinating, it is not boring. We know the story by heart, and it is not boring. It should. And nothing, no modification. So, latreia logique, not the sacrifice of giving up rationality, the exact reverse. No liturgy, no cult, no worship, which could not be based on a kind of rationality. So when you know the real crisis of reason, who you have to be, the question is there something which can be reached and seen? That's the first moment. What shows itself? Quickly speaking, I think that there are some principles of what may show itself. The first rule in this kind of rational theology, so to speak, this alliance between reason and faith, the result is first, the first rule. About God, we know nothing. And we cannot imagine that we could reach a definition, at least during his lifetime, of God in any way. But we at least know one thing for sure about God, that he is God and we are not. Even atheists can agree about that God is not like us. And would God be like us, it would not be God, and we were not interested. And even atheists deny God precisely because the God is not like us, and we are not at the same level. So we all agree about that. How this border can be described. As ancient Greeks, Romans, and all the old civilization agreed with the Christians and with the Bible and with the early modern philosophy and the Enlightenment and with the postmodern deconstructionists to say that the difference between the divine and the finite beings comes down to the fact that for the finite beings, there is a difference between the possible and the impossible. And as the Greeks used to say, for the gods, nothing is impossible. It's why they have to give up their gods, because many things were impossible to them. But this principle, the impossible is what makes sense only for us, finite, stands. And we have in the Genesis, the book of Genesis, the same formulation than in the first chapter of Luke about the impossible birth of a son from either a virgin or an old lady, that the angel or God says, when asked, but this is not possible, the answer, nothing is impossible to God. So the right definition of God, I think everyone would agree, is that for God, nothing is impossible. So we shall start by saying reason according to faith includes that for God nothing is impossible. I say, how could you say that? But we can say that if we imagine that a point of view of God about reason can be understood. What does that mean to understood? To understand reason from the point of view of God, as we are not in the situation to have the point of view of God, indeed. Well, not so fast as Hillary Clinton used to say to Obama during the last debate of the Democrat primaries, the previous run back. Not too quick. Not too quick. Because, strangely enough, the classical philosophy, which was achieved by the Enlightenment, to oversimplify, had a great principle that in philosophy we can think and admit into being, at least possible being, enjoying an essence, if not always an existence, anything which can be thought without contradicting itself. That's the principle of identity. The first determination of being is that it does not contradict itself. It is not impossible. And for those who have studied philosophy, they know that in Russell, in all traditional metaphysical analytic philosophy, this principle stands. Nothing can be, possibly, if it contradicts itself. So the distinction between the possible and the impossible is not an abstract one. It is the basis of traditional philosophy. When you say, for God, nothing is impossible, you just mean, and you agree with traditional philosophy, that philosophy is only fitting the requirements of matching the expectation of a finite mind, which is absolutely correct. But the question is whether the reason according to God should be equal to the reason according to what is not God. So, something possible is something whose definition does not contradict. Contradict what? The concept. But the concept for our mind. So the idea that there is perhaps a broader, wider rationality than the rationality shaped by the distinction between possible and impossible makes perfect sense. I don't claim that we can think that way. But we cannot deny the possibility that reason could expand that way. And now let us go further to the next step. What about the possible achievement of the impossible? Because I say the impossible is possible for God. Okay, but you are not God. So can you go a bit further? The answer is yes, indeed. Because the experience of the impossible made possible is exactly what is told by the Bible. That is, there are two signs of God in the actuality of the world, which are at least a claim of the Bible, is that the creation out of nothing and the resurrection from the dead. So those are the two claims of the Old, the First and the Second Testament. So everything is rooted on two cases where what was made real was the impossible. So you can, and in particular the question of creation remains open. It's why there is a debate about evolution, and so on. I think this is not a question which is correctly asked. So there is no correct answer. But anyways, this is not the point. The question of creation remains central. And I would now add another argument, which is that the impossible is not impossible for us to experience. That is, the effectivity of the impossible. So I have no time to develop in details the argument. But to sum it up, it runs this way. Our own life is based on some few, but never forgettable, and still acting upon us, impossible events which happen to us. Something which, what is an impossible event? It is an event which does not start by being intelligible, that is possible, before being achieved into existence. Most of the time, we conceive something as possible, and after that, we try to bring it into existence because it is possible. It's what we do in the industry of everywhere. We prepare, it is possible, it should work, and we try to enforce it. Okay. There are events, or rather, events are the situation where something happens perfectly effective, which was not anticipated, and we have no prior expectation of it. We are completely surprised, and it was not foreseen. And even when it is achieved in front of us, we don't understand what is going on. And we say that it is impossible. We have never seen that. It is impossible, inconceivable. That is 4 years. We have never seen that. Or this is the first time that it is impossible. And we are right to say that. Because when we say it is impossible, September 11 was real. And many people said it is impossible. And they were right. Why? Because it was, even after the fact, impossible to the extent that it could not be explained. It was a contradiction at many levels in the terms. And you could add that all the real historical events which are documented and about which all historians continue to write books and books and books. All the historical events remain impossible. No one has understood why the Soviet Revolution could be achieved in 1917. Why World War I started in 1940. Why Hitler came to power at the very moment when his Nazi party was on the decay. We have no explanation of that. So it is to some extent impossible, to the point that you have always a crazy fake historian pretending that there was no real 7/11, that Napoleon never existed, and all that stuff. Because those events cannot be explained in the normal way. And let us go now to our individual life. Our individual life is framed by those kind of events, which are impossible to understand, although they are very obviously effective. And we spend our whole life to try to understand the consequences of those impossible realities. Just to say, and I stop with that, that the question of the impossible is central to a broader reason. we can experience things which cannot be objectively understood and would never be. And this is a part of reason. Would reason never expand its territories, reason will be dead. A living reason, a living rationality is an expanding rationality. And faith is a way to expand the limits and the power of reason. Last point. Who is the one who can know and practice this broader reason? There is here a strange logic, because according to classical Christian theology, only the saint can do that. And if you can do that, surprisingly enough, you are to some extent yet a saint, which means that most of us are saints, if we practice the impossible. And we do. And the characteristic of the saint is that you cannot see it. The saint is invisible. And this is based on two arguments. The first is a very banal argument, the argument about what the witness is. You know this paradox, which was told again and again by many survivors of the death camp, of the Gulag, of the Shoah, and so on. They all say, when they come back, and they make stories like Primo Levi, who else? This very famous American writer who died recently. Please? Exactly. Solzhenitsyn told that, my father told me that. We are not qualified to tell what happened because we survived, which means that we were a bit away of the center of hell. We have not seen everything. Would we have experienced everything? We were not here speaking about that. So always this strange feeling for us, we are not involved in that, that they have a feeling of guiltiness when speaking out. They witness with some bad consciousness, surprising. But you understand that very well. That is, if you are really a witness, you cannot speak. You were involved in that. So this is a paradox. It's why history is so difficult to write, because it is difficult to have the real witness. So there is always a slice of the issue which remain close to the most devoted, scrupulous, and serious historian. But there is this another argument which is really theological, but widely spread in the New Testament in particular, which is the argument of the first epistle to John, for instance, chapter 3. The Word does not know us because he does not know him. Beloved, none, that is both now and for real, we are the Son of God. But what we are does not appear yet. And Paul, in Colossians, if it is written by Paul, Paul in Colossians 3:3 says, our life remains hidden in Christ. That is, in fact, the real experience of the impossible, which after all, at the end of it, is God. The real impossible of God cannot be expressed within the horizon of the possible for us. And this is very consistent, although it is a bit odd. That is, to make the impossible visible in a world which is finite and limited by the limits of the possible for us, we have to modify the world. That is, you have to have, if not another word, a word different from what it is right now. The claim for the renewal of the word by Christianity and biblical thought and Jewish people and perhaps many others is not based only on the fact that there is so much sin, failure, suffering in the world that we have to improve it. It is deeper than that. In our word, the achievement of all things cannot be seen. So we have to build up a new theater with a broader stage. If not, the show cannot go on. The show must go on. The theater is too narrow, too tiny. And it's why a new theater will come down from the sky, from heavens, as the new bride, the new Jerusalem. So we need to have a more a bolder and broader view of the situation than what we have. I understand that it can look a bit paradoxical, but you know, the paradox is a form of thinking, a logical form of thinking, where the usual logic is contradicted by logic, because the paradox is not a logical flow. It is the fact that logic goes beyond logic. And it is well known, there are logicians who work about the paradox, so it is not unheard at all. The paradox is a form of logic. And I would say that theology, the Jewish Christian thought about God, should be based on paradoxes. It's why there is Jewish humor, which is exactly the practice of paradox, and the Christian should do the same. And let us conclude about paradox by a quotation of Kierkegaard, who was not very funny, but who said something very funny about a very funny character, about Don Giovanni. He said that Don Giovanni, philosophy without paradox would be as a kind of Don Giovanni without sexual desire. I am for a theology which would be the theology made by the equivalent in theology of Don Giovanni. I thank you very much for your attention.